welcome back to the Liberation Hour. It is me, once again, Comrade Felicity, coming at you live from WRFU 104.5, Radio Free Urbana. Folks, it is that time again. It is Wednesday at 7 p.m., and so we are here at the Liberation Hour, and it is time for the top of the hour disclaimer. WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign online community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU-UC IMC. Folks, we have a lot of news today. This episode, I'm super excited because I pre-recorded a segment with my partner, Roman. Yes, he is a candidate with the American Party of Labor in the Great Plains region over in Kansas City. And he's currently in Spain right now, but we pre-recorded an episode for y'all about Jesus. I know, crazy, because we're both atheists. But Roman was raised Catholic, and I was not raised religious. However, I find religion to be a very interesting topic and something that is very pertinent to understanding communist society. How does religion fit into it? And who is Jesus really? I also think that Jesus is an interesting figure, as he really does embody a lot of socialist values that I don't think a lot of people have really thought about. And so I'm super excited to play the first 30 minutes of that for y'all on air today. And you can find the rest of it, as usual, on my YouTube channel at Comrade Felicity or Communist Bananas. I'm super excited to air this for y'all, as Roman has a lot of insight. He studied religious studies and philosophy in college. And yeah, a ton of really cool stuff, really good stuff, and we're really excited to show you guys that episode. And so stick around for that to start playing at 7:30 p.m. All right, so let's get to the news. There is no time to waste. I have some great stories for y'all. I know that recently there has been a lot of coverage on the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I will kind of get into that today, but I covered it last Wednesday when the assassination occurred, and there's not really a lot else to say. My views still stand. I do not believe in vigilante justice. I do not think that that it will ultimately bring liberation to the working class. I think that Charlie Kirk was a terrible human being. And, he died as he lived, saying that, well, some of you are going to die, but that is a sacrifice that I am willing to make for my gun rights. So that's all I'm going to say about that. We have some much more important topics to be covering today, and the first one that I want to cover is the targeting of HBCUs and the Mississippi lynchings that have occurred over the last week. So after the assassination attempt, the actual assassination that happened on Charlie Kirk, I want to say the day or second day after this happened, maybe the first day after this happened, there was a lot of different threats that were going after HBCUs, also known as historically black colleges and universities, and there were 2 lynchings that occurred in Mississippi. On the lynchings first, authorities in Mississippi are investigating 2 separate incidents involving men found hanging within 24 hours, raising alarm and prompting calls for transparency as communities grapple with the shock and grief. This is coming from reporting from News One's, from Tiffany Hamilton. The second victim mentioned in the story, Corey Zucatis, it should be noted, is not black. The first victim, who was found in Delta State University, I believe he was a college freshman, was found hanging around 7:05 a.m. On Monday, Delta State University police confirmed that it was a 21-year-old student, DeMartravian Trey, also known as Trey Reed, a black man, was found dead on campus in Cleveland, Mississippi. University Police Chief Michael L. Peeler said during a press conference that Reed's body was discovered hanging from a tree near the pickleball courts at approximately 7:05 a.m. Reed's death in Cleveland, this is Cleveland, Mississippi specifically, has drawn heightened attention, especially after black colleges received bomb threats following the death of controversial podcaster, also known as neo-Nazi right-wing podcaster, Charlie Kirk. This was not what I just said, him being a neo-Nazi and a white supremacist. That was not mentioned in the article. That's something that I put because it's important to understand. The fact that black colleges, historically black colleges, and a black man were targeted after the assassination of a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist. Those are not two unrelated incidents. Charlie Kirk was not assassinated by a black person. Charlie Kirk was actually assassinated by a white person. And yet, minorities always pay for this. Minorities are always the ones that end up bearing the brunt of the hate and the problems that arise from situations like this. And we can see that with the bomb threats and the lynching. While the police are currently saying that there's no signs of foul play, I don't trust the police. I've said that before on air, and I'll say it again. I don't trust the police. I do not trust that they don't think that this is this was any kind of foul play. The police in Denver said the same thing when they found the trans woman Jax, who had been missing and who was found dead in an alley 7 weeks later. They always say this. There was no foul play found. There were no problems. This was probably a suicide. And you know what? Even if it was, let's see the recordings. I mean, university campuses have surveillance everywhere. I would know, as I am a university student myself. While I do not go to Delta State University, I would suspect that because it is a college in the modern era, they probably do have a lot of surveillance already. I think that we should be pushing as much as the family is pushing right now to see that surveillance and to see, was this actually a suicide or was this a lynching? Because we need to rule out all possibilities if the police are just going to jump to the conclusion that this wasn't a lynching. The police are not to be trusted, point blank. We cannot trust the cops on this. If it was a suicide, we need further evidence and proof. I don't care. I don't care. Mainly because, as I have said time and time again, the Black community has been historically targeted by angry white mobs that want quote unquote justice for crimes or just to do something terrible to Black people, because that is what this country was founded on. Point blank, it was founded off of the blood and the backs of Black and brown people. We cannot forget that. And the police, the institution of the police, are white supremacists. You know, the institution of the police was founded on slave catching. And the police have always historically targeted Black and brown neighborhoods. We can see that with like the policing in the 80s and the 90s, especially with the epidemic of crack, which was introduced by the CIA. This is not unfounded information. We do know these things, and it's extremely important to believe families, believe people of color when they say, hey, this doesn't look right. We need further evidence. If it's ruled and we can see that from all of the evidence provided and dug up by folks who are trying to fight the good fight here, that it was a suicide, okay, cool. You know, we exhausted all avenues. But do not trust the cops on this. The cops lie. The police lie. They have a huge history of lying. And I will not trust them and their ruling on the suspicious death of a Black man hanging from a tree at 7 a.m. You're telling me that he just walked out there and hung himself or hanged himself and there's no... and he just did it right there? Really? Okay, let's see the footage. Let's see the evidence, because this is not adding up. And this also goes into the bomb threats. This is from ABC News. Multiple historically Black colleges and universities are on lockdown after, and this was reported on 9/11, after receiving potential threats on Thursday, including Alabama State University, Virginia State University, Hampton University in Virginia, Southern University in Louisiana, and Clark Atlanta University in Georgia. After the campus lockdown was lifted later Thursday afternoon, the university announced it was canceling all campus activities and classes on Thursday, Friday, and through the weekend. The Congressional Black Caucus released a statement on Thursday saying the threats made against several historically black colleges and universities are not only vile, they are also a chilling reminder of the relentless racism and extremism that continue to target and terrorize black communities in this country. Period. End of story. That's the point right there. We cannot look at this situation as disconnected from white supremacy. The fact that historically black colleges and universities were the ones that were getting bomb threats and were just being threatened at all after the death of a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist, may I add, a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist, the fact that these universities were getting bomb threats, those are not disconnected events. This was happening as a result. This is at least correlated with the situation because people are freaking crazy. I can't swear on here. It's so upsetting. People are insane. People are actually insane, and this is what people do, unfortunately. And it will not stop until we, as the working class, collectively recognize that the United States is a white supremacist country, and that needs to be dismantled point blank. We cannot forget about our black comrades in this time. We must continue to fight for black liberation, and that means dismantling white supremacy, and that means calling these things what they are. This was a lynching, and this was a threat on black Americans' lives. Period. End of story. There is no reasoning with this. And so my next story actually it's a little bit different, but I think that I didn't get a really big chance to cover it last week because it was just happening. But the revolution in Nepal, folks, on Friday night, and this is from The Nation, reporting from The Nation from Wen Stevenson. On Friday night, after days of nationwide upheaval in which at least 70 people were killed, many of them young anti-corruption protesters, and the resignation of Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli, I hope I'm saying that correctly, I'm sorry if I'm not, the respected jurist Sushila Kariki was sworn in as interim prime minister following tense negotiations mediated by the chief general of Nepal's army. Young people were protesting the endemic corruption and nepotism of the country's political leaders, as well as the deep economic and social inequality. When the government announced a near total ban on social media on September 5th, a mere 11 days ago, popular anger was overwhelming, and Gen Z groups led by organization Hami Nepal and used VPNs to call for a large and peaceful demonstration outside of Parliament on September 8th. The rally and march, which included school children in their uniforms along with an amorphous mass of thousands of young protesters, was infiltrated by other, older and more radical forces who attacked police and attempted to storm the Parliament compound. The police guarding the Parliament fired live ammunition into the crowd, killing at least 20 protesters, who precisely gave the orders to fire on the protesters is now under investigation. The next day, on September 9th, amid an outrage at the massacre, mayhem ensued. Not only were the main government buildings torched, but the homes of the prime minister and other party leaders and ministers were attacked and burned. And the violence and arson took on a momentum of its own, spreading to hotels, including Kathmandu, Hilton, and corporate offices, media companies, and even retail chains and EV showrooms, symbols of the wealthy elite. Now, I know that article, I'm not sure how I feel about it, honestly, because Western reporting can be super, cannot be very reliable, especially when reporting on situations like this, because it does have a very liberal bias. However, I think that the principle here that we need to be taking away from is the fact that young people in Nepal revolted against a corrupt government that was willing to take away their rights to free speech. I know of a government that's doing something similar. This is not a call to action to say we should overthrow the government. No. This is simply an observation. Our government is currently doing the same thing. In fact, Jimmy Kimmel was just deplatformed by, I believe, ABC because the FCC did not like the very benign comments that he made about the Charlie Kirk assassination. It really wasn't even that bad. And so it's unsurprising that it's honestly, it's unsurprising that this is being reported on this way, but I would like to say, giving my own two cents here, there's a lot of misinformation going around about the fact that Gen Z only did this because, oh, you took away their social media. No, this had actually been brewing for a while. Part of the reason that this ban even happened is because Gen Z was already organizing. Young people in Nepal were already organizing around basically dismantling the government because because of the insane conditions that they were living under. And the fact is that the government is extremely corrupt. The government saw that young people in Nepal were working to basically demonstrate, and that's why they did the ban. This is not new information. You can look it up yourself. You can see why exactly this happened, and this just made people more angry. I don't think that the Nepal government was really anticipating that this was going to happen, but that's not surprising either. From The Guardian, it says that for some, Nepal has finally broken free of the elite corrupt politics that held back the country for years, following in the footsteps of its neighbors Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, where youth-led revolts have toppled entrenched veteran leaders. Others are concerned about the unknown consequences for a country that has only become a democratic republic in 2006. It says Tanu. I'm so bad at spelling. I'm so bad at pronouncing names. I'm so sorry to the person that was quoted in this article. I believe their name is Tanuja Pandey. And if I'm getting that wrong, again, my apologies. This person is 26, and it says one of the faces of the Gen Z protests emphasized that the toppling of the elite government was not part of the pre-planned conspiracy. The wealth of those in power and with access had grown enormously, while others continued to suffer, she said. Our generation, Generation Z, is bearing the cost of this, and that's what forced us out onto the streets. This right here that's I think a perfect encapsulation of how people are feeling. We don't want to do, I don't think people necessarily want to do violent revolt. That's not necessarily something that people just aspire to. These conditions have been brought about by elites in power who cannot help themselves but be corrupt. Because this is what mass accumulation of wealth does to a person. We can see that if people's material conditions are crap and they're living in filth and they're not able to get a job and they're not able to have an upward mobility, and there's more and more and more people are experiencing this, yeah, they're gonna revolt. That's kind of just how it works. The fact that people are surprised that this happened, I have to say, look at our own material conditions here in the United States. I'm a young person, and I'm currently experiencing poor material conditions as a result. But I would say probably not the same as a lot of young people in Nepal, but still, the principle remains the same. Young people we're bearing the brunt of what our forefathers have, the conditions in which they have created for us, which are not good ones. We're currently trying to make it in a world in its capitalist hellscape that, for all intents and purposes, does not care about us, does not care about our well-being or our upward mobility. You see, the first generation that really started to experience this was Generation X, with one of the generations with some of the highest student loan debt. Then you have the millennials who, famously, and this is kind of a meme now, have been talking about, I can't be a homeowner, I'm going to be a renter for life because I can't accumulate enough wealth to be able to buy a house. The American dream is effectively dead, or in my opinion, it was never alive. It was alive for a few people, but in general, here in the States, things are not much better. And so this is unsurprising, honestly. Again, from the Guardian, anger in Nepal, where the median age is just 25, has been building. Endless corruption scandals and ongoing political instability. The country has had 14 prime ministers in 16 years. has left young people feeling increasingly disenfranchised. For the majority of the young people of Nepal grappling with crippling inflation, economic hardships, and high youth unemployment, driving millions to find exploitative, often deadly labor work abroad in places such as the Gulf, and the images of wealth and luxury were damning proof that Nepal's political system was broken. Talk of revolution in coffee shops of Kathmandu had increased after youth-led protest movements across South Asia resulted in the departures of Sri Lanka's authoritarian leader, Gotabaya I'm not even trying to, R. His last name starts with an R, who fled the capital, Colombo, in 2022. And Bangladesh's Sheikh Hasina, who left Bangladesh last year. Recent mass student-led protests in Indonesia over deep economic frustration and the lavish perks for politicians have also been widely cited as an inspiration. Period. That's where there, right there. Young people are being, we are inspired because young people everywhere, Gen Z people everywhere, and even younger are seeing that our material conditions can change. We do not have to stay in this. This is not permanent. Things can change and they should. We should not accept a world which is not willing to accept us. There is a world in which, social equality and economic equality and access to resources for all happens and exists. And it is something that we can fight for and that we can continue to organize around. I know that it seems so far away, but I promise that the more that we organize and the more that we find each other and we find our shared interests of labor and human empathy, we can and we will make these changes. It's a matter of time. And this is why young people everywhere, we should be following the lead of the young people in Nepal, the young people in Sri Lanka, the young people in Bangladesh. This can become a worldwide movement if we let it. And we should, because it has proven that young people can and should make these changes. We should not accept these conditions just because they were what we were born into. That doesn't mean anything. We can change them and we should change them. And this brings me to my last story of the night before I go ahead and play you guys the first half of my recording with Comrade Roman. Chicago, man, I don't believe this happened in Chicago. I believe this happened, in the suburbs. It was in Franklin Park. A man was killed by ICE. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security said an officer shot Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, 38, during a traffic stop on Friday in Franklin Park. DHS on September 8th launched a deportation crackdown in Illinois that it said was targeting criminals among immigrants in the U.S. without legal status. The department said the operation was necessary because of city and state sanctuary laws that limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities. This is coming from Reuters, written by Hickman and Schultz. ICE declined to provide more details on the incident over the weekend. It referred to a press release that said Villegas Gonzalez had a history of reckless driving and that the ICE agent fired his weapon because he feared for his life. Okay, I have a lot of feelings about this. The first one being rage. What? It has since come out that this man did not have an actual criminal record. If you actually look at the traffic stops and the quote-unquote bad driving record that this man has, it's nowhere. There are plenty of Americans, honestly, like actual homegrown Americans that didn't immigrate that probably have a much worse driving record than this man. Like, this is completely unprecedented. It is wrong. And this man, you know what he was doing before he got shot and killed by an ICE officer? He was dropping his kids off at school. That's what he was doing. He wasn't smuggling drugs or doing anything, he wasn't doing anything illegal at all. He was being a father. And he was driving, that's all he was doing, he was driving. And because the Supreme Court, yes, I'm gonna put the Supreme Court on blast for a second here. And because the Supreme Court has now said, not that this wasn't happening to begin with, but now that the Supreme Court has basically said, yeah, it's legal, you can racially profile any Latino that you see, it's cool, yeah, it's fine. This is what happens. This man, ICE is lying. Once again, the police are lying. This man did not have a criminal record. This man was not a danger to society. He was a regular guy. He was a guy that, immigrated, and now he's here, and he's working, and he's just a regular person. He's a human being, and he was shot and killed by ICE because he was scared. I would be terrified too. I would be so terrified if I got stopped by masked men with unidentifiable, who were completely unidentifiable, who were working outside the law to detain me and send me to some random country that I've never been to. Because that's what this country is doing right now. It is so incompetent that it can't even at least send people back to where they actually came from. It's sending them to just random places because it can. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I'm saying here from NBC, from Strickler and Guevara, immigration, let's see. Every use of force incident and any discharge of an ICE firearm must be properly reported and reviewed by the agency in accordance with agency policy, procedure, and guidelines. McLaughlin wrote in an email. I believe it's probably an official with the department. All shootings are initially reviewed by the appropriate federal, state, and local or tribal law enforcement agency, principally charged with first response of the incident. Following the review of the incident for the appropriate investigative agency, ICE will conduct an independent review of the critical incident. That's like the CIA saying we investigated ourselves and we did nothing wrong. That's complete horse manure. That is ridiculous. I have never heard something more ridiculous in my life. I don't care what procedures you're meant to follow. That doesn't mean that they're doing it. There is absolutely no accountability right now. There is absolutely zero, zip, zilch. Because if there was, this man would still be alive. If there was any accountability, ICE wouldn't exist to begin with. Because all they have done is harm. That is what they have done. There is no accountability for these people. There is none. The fact that the person who shot and killed this man is still roaming free, no issues, that speaks to a larger systemic problem. This is systemic. This is not going to be fixed, as some liberals will try to convince you. This is not going to be fixed by just reforming ICE. We just need to reform them. No, honey, that's not how it works. You don't get to tell the Nazis, well, you can't openly be a Nazi. You got to hide it a little better, and you have to follow a procedure to be a Nazi. That's still a Nazi. You're still doing the Nazi stuff. You just put a special little sticker on it that said, and now we're official and we can do it. It doesn't matter. This needs to be completely dismantled. ICE needs to be dismantled. ICE needs to be abolished. This is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And a man has lost his life as a result of this. I don't care that an ICE officer was injured. I don't care. This ICE officer the harm was already done when this man was stopped in a quote-unquote routine traffic stop because he's apparently a criminal with no criminal record. How are you going to be a criminal with no criminal record, huh? Apparently, they said that they were only going after the criminals. This man was dropping his kids off at school. He's not a criminal. He never was. And now he's gone. And his children are going to be fatherless. I care way more about the fact that this man's kids are going to be without a dad for the rest of their lives because one selfish agency decided, well, time to shoot this guy because he's scared, because he's terrified that we're going to take him from his children anyway. I care way more about the fact that this man was murdered by ICE than I will ever care about Charlie Kirk getting murked by some rando on the internet. Whatever, dude. This is crazy. Anyway, we're getting almost to 7:30, and that means that it is time for me to play you guys my interview or my discussion with Comrade Roman on Jesus the Socialist. Now, of course, Jesus was not actually a socialist. He was not a trade unionist. Communism didn't even exist at that point, but I think that this conversation I had with Comrade Roman really highlights and signifies a much broader understanding of Jesus as a revolutionary figure for his time and the story of Jesus as something that's very similar to the stories that we hear now about all kinds of figures and those who are revolutionary as well. Jesus, him specifically as a man, not as like a mystical being and the Son of God, but more as a person, and the things that he did and what he stood for have really changed the course of history and the way that we view these historical figures. And so I'm super excited to play this for y'all. This is the first 30 minutes of my discussion with Comrade Roman. You can watch the rest of it on my YouTube channel. And yeah, have a good time listening. I'll be back in 30 minutes.
Hi, Liberation Hour. I'm Roman Cosentino. First things first, disclaimer, I'm Felicity's partner, so This is potentially a biased interview.
No, it's not. It is not. We are but in love.
That means that we can really fight with each other.
Yes.
And it's okay, right?
Yeah, it's fine. It's just more meaningful, I guess. I don't know.
But I'm another APL candidate in the Great Plains region. And I, just do what left-wing organizing I can. I'm involved with Casey Tenants at home in Kansas City. I do a lot of work with the Casey Tenants ceasefire team, and we're organizing for Palestinian liberation. And right now, I'm currently in Barcelona. I've been studying Spanish, and here I'm involved with a group called Boycott Carrefour, BCN, if you want to look it up on Instagram. And it's just we're building off of the BDS movement that's started and led by Palestinians, and we're specifically targeting Carrefour because of their complicity in the genocide, and here in Europe, they're one of the big companies that does have a base here in Europe. So, yeah. Oh, and then with the Spanish too, I'm hoping to come back and use that to help with the immigration battle back home. And I would encourage anyone who can to join a rapid response network. In Kansas City, it's AIR, and they do a lot of great work.
Period. Yes. All good things. All good things. And I think that especially with the Palestine stuff, I mean, you were there when the Freedom Flotilla, when they left Barcelona with Greta Thunberg. So saw her from afar.
Very cool, special moment to be a part of, and we're hoping and praying that goes well.
Yeah, I've been keeping up with the news, but so welcome. This is.
Oh, and I guess I should also say I was a religious studies major in college, and today we're going to be talking about Jesus. So that's my very weak credential to.
But he's your guy,
Roman, and my favorite Palestinian.
And your favorite Palestinian. Also, you were raised Catholic, correct?
Yes, I was raised Catholic.
Italian Catholic. Yes.
And in many ways, still a cultural Catholic,
I would agree with that.
But we don't mess with the church like that.
No. I think that where I'd want to start this conversation off is the discussion around Jesus as a historical figure rather than necessarily the Son of God. Sorry about that. And I think that when people think about religion and communism, they think that the two can't coexist, that they're mutually exclusive, and I disagree with that. I think that we can have a communist society and do socialist revolution and still include religion, but it's also with the understanding that religion shouldn't have any political power,
right.
And and Jesus as a figure, I think he's way more aligned with socialist values than a lot of right wingers give him credit for.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit on him as a historical figure and just learning about him in your program and also, through the church and, being part of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like the first thing to say is like I think 100% there's like a socialist, communist current that runs through like Jesus's message. But at the same time, it's not exactly appropriate to say like Jesus was a communist.
Yeah.
Like the proletarian class did not yet exist, and
I was being a bit inflammatory when I named the episode.
yeah. But I mean, I think that he would definitely be more aligned with socialism, communism, anarchism today than he would be with conservative movements today, for sure.
Yeah, there's no hate like Christian love, right?
Yeah. And I think like where that comes from and in a way why he's like a unique figure in terms of like world historical figures in general and religious figures is like from what we can tell and best hypothesize, he was a Jewish Palestinian peasant. And I think that like his class position at that time, being a peasant really characterized his worldview. And in conjunction with that, like the position of Palestine being under Roman occupation at the time. I think if you're not viewing Jesus with those two things in mind, then you're gonna misinterpret his message in his life.
Yeah, we often hear Jesus was a carpenter,
Mm-hmm.
He was a trade unionist. No.
I wish that would be
that would be
cool.
really based. No, but we often hear stories about Jesus hanging out with like the poor and like downtrodden. We hear about him having hung out with prostitutes and really calling out the wealthy as like the problem. Especially in the Bible. I feel like by a lot of right wingers and honestly probably liberals too, who try to ascribe neoliberal or more like individualist values to Jesus's story, I'm like, I don't really think that you're being like genuine with that, because the story of Jesus is like a figure, being the son of God through mythology, I guess. But as like you said, a historical figure, he was just a guy who started this whole religious movement, presumably on accident.
Yeah. I think like the number one difference between how conservatives today like present Jesus's message versus what it actually was is like, conservative Christianity today is normally, used to support the current system that we have and support the people in power. And if you just like read the Gospels, it's with an open mind, it's pretty clear that like Jesus was entirely opposed to the socio-economic and political system at the time.
Yeah, and also a revolutionary in himself, like kind of being against like the Roman occupation, like being like like directly opposed to that, and that was the reason for his subsequent death. Like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
feels very reminiscent.
I mean, there's like, to go back to basics, like, I mean, there's not really that much that we can say with 100% certainty that like Jesus did or like who he was. Like there just isn't. But there's two facts that uh, religious studies scholars will say 100% were true, and that's that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and then the other one is that he was crucified by the Romans. And if we just take that second one there, him being crucified by the Romans, crucifixion was very specifically a punishment that was reserved for insurrectionaries, people who
Political
represented a threat,
dissidents.
a political threat to the Roman Empire. And even like one of the few common things we have in all three Gospels is that like the inscription on the cross was King of the Jews. And you don't put King of the Jews on the cross unless you think that they, somehow like represent a threat to the emperor. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when we're talking about especially an empire being so threatened by this one person, and like using a very specific political tactic to kill him, they could have just, they couldn't have shot him because they didn't have guns. But like they could have just like stabbed the guy, or beheaded him or whatever they did, but it's a very specific choice to put someone on a cross. It's a very specific decision.
And it's a very brutal, brutal, brutal punishment, not a way you want to die, for sure.
And it was him and two disciples. Is that correct?
The common story is not that they were disciples, but they're, I don't know. I think in my view, they probably were followers of Jesus that were crucified with him. But the famous one is that it was a thief, and then I forget what the other one was, but yeah, like they wouldn't like. I think it's clear that like in the Gospels they manipulated that to say to take the political resonance out of it. And there's other instances where like Mark uses like thief for a stand-in for what was probably disciples. So yeah.
No, I think that I think it's a very politically charged story. I think that when I think of revolution and I think of like revolutionary figures, we often think about someone, with the qualities that many ascribe to that of Jesus. Someone very kind, someone like a leader of a movement. The thing that comes to my mind is like Fred Hampton. Like he was not Jesus, of course. He was Fred Hampton. But like when you look at the way that he was followed by, when as chairman of the Black Panthers, and also what he preached and talked about. I mean, he was not a religious person, I don't think. I don't actually know a ton about that, but he was a communist, and he was in his own way by the FBI crucified for that.
Yes.
And when I think about Jesus's story, I almost think of him as like a first revolutionary to like this cause against a giant empire that essentially wants to stamp out any and all idea of like human connection, and love. Because when I just, I had said there's no hate like Christian love, it's like Christians now love to push this narrative that they're just they just love you so much, that they're just so like they're so holy and so religious. And I think that's really disingenuous because a lot of their politics are not like that. um
Mhm.
it's like a complete disconnection between what it actually is supposed to mean versus how it's being interpreted, and I think a big part of that is the institution of the church. um
Yeah.
and there's like a huge case to be made for why the church should be put on trial for the people, especially with
Yeah.
how many people it's hurt. I mean, literally everyone, even if you're a straight white man, there's still a good chance that like a priest probably did some like really screwed up stuff to you, you know, like that has happened in the Catholic Church. There's a lot of it's created itself to be a very untrustworthy institution, and I think a large part of that is because of the introduction of capital into the church as like a viable source, like a way
Yeah.
to control people.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think,
ultimately, oh, go
yeah,
ahead, go
no,
ahead.
no.
No, you go
Well,
ahead.
I think to like take it before even getting into like the social aspect of it, like the church's treatment of queer people and name whatever group.
Yeah,
But like to take it back to like the class analysis is at Jesus's time not much different than now. Like there's
yeah,
really three kinds of people, three classes of people. There's peasants, and then and broadly speaking, people who work with their hands. And at that time, there wasn't really like a middle class that
yeah,
in the same way there is now. So even then, it's even more pronounced, the inequality. So people who basically just work for a subsistence living, and then there's the political authorities like the kings and whoever they're installing to rule over a certain area, and then there's the priestly class, and I think that like Jesus was definitely coming from the perspective of being a representative of what then we could call the working class of that time,
yeah.
and also people who I guess you might not even like call working class. I forget what the word they used back then was, but like people who like the equivalent of today is homeless people or mentally ill people, people who are below subsistence level. And yeah. So
Yeah,
he's definitely coming from representing those two groups as opposed to the priestly class and the political class.
yeah, it definitely feels like Jesus is like was always meant to be a working class figure. And there's a lot of working class people that worship and like, you know, they practice Christianity and they practice like the faith and everything. But overwhelmingly the church has become a bourgeois institution, especially when we think about like the Vatican and how much political power it strangely has when it shouldn't. Like um you know, especially like I think a big thing that was kind of coming up, especially when Pope Francis was still alive before he passed. um I think it was earlier this year that he passed away. Like especially with like what's going on in Gaza and everything. An overwhelmingly number of the Zionist group aren't even Jewish people. It's Christian Zionists who view
Mm.
Jews as this magical group of people that if they are all put in one specific place, then the rapture will be triggered. And I mean, you hear that and you're like, oh, that's actually insane. That's like so
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah,
But also it's kind of insinuating in a very sinister way, I think, that Jesus would have condoned what's happening in Gaza right now.
yeah. I mean, I think like, well, it's funny because I do think that in one sense that there's like is like the most fundamental Christians sometimes are more aligned, and it's that like I do think that Jesus was, you could argue, like an apocalyptic figure where like he wanted to bring about like the divine intervention to usher in the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
But you have to take that in the context of them living under Roman occupation.
To
So
them,
so if
heaven was,
anything, yeah, like
sorry, yeah.
he's more like because the evangelicals and the fundamentalist Christians here don't have a grasp on like the real political aspect of it and settler colonialism and imperialism. They like I don't think they understand that aspect of it at all. Like
It's very disconnected from reality.
it's a very it's a very wrong interpretation of like that like kind of apocalyptic view. And I think that um like if anything, like Jesus would be, way closer to like a jihadist now,
Yeah. No,
like
that's so true. And
yeah.
especially
And yeah.
no, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
And I like I think that those views like come from a place of like wanting justice in the world, uh, and yeah, I think like Jesus is basically the same.
Yeah, no, like when I say like Jesus was like one of the first revolutionaries, I think about when I think about his story, and I was not raised specifically religious. My dad was raised Catholic, my mom was raised fundamentalist Christian. They are both now out of the church, their respective churches. They don't practice those faiths anymore. But my dad, when I told him how you feel very culturally Catholic, he actually really resonated with that.
Yeah.
um, and I think that it's because Jesus's story is so like fundamental to the way that we think about a lot of like working class relationships right now, where like him dying on the cross for our sins and everything. Like, okay, as an atheist myself, I don't think that's true. I think that, however, in the political context of the time, first of all, I do think that Jesus as like a person, he probably did exist. Like there is probably like a good chance that a guy at the time existed and that a story similar to this one took place, which kind of
Mm.
I think shows a movement in humanity's consciousness around how we view power, you know,
Mhm.
and this idea that a guy, a minority, mind you, um, whose home is being occupied, just even like the beginning, like how he was born, the baby born in a manger in the freaking barn, like that is a specific storytelling, um, like I don't know, like motif or that's a specific storytelling situation. I don't know what word I'm looking for, where it's like
Yeah.
he could have been born in a palace. He's the
Yeah.
son of God. When he's
Yeah.
explained he's the son of God, he's like this divine being. But he was born in these conditions, to these two parents who are working class, very specifically working class people. And his story follows his life specifically with the poor. You don't see Jesus out here slinging it with Epstein or whatever
Mhm.
his Epstein equivalent was back then, the rich, the money changers or whatever. Like you don't see Jesus out here being like, I'm going to boogie down with the kings of the empire or whatever. Like he was specifically hanging out with poor people. When he died, he was specifically dying for the rights of poor people and the right
Mhm.
specifically of Jews to be emancipated, in whatever context that looked like for the time. Like it's very specific to the time again because he did not the guns didn't even freaking exist back then. So it's a very different political context. But the consciousness of people was kind of shifting, I think. And this story, this mythology created out of possibly just this one person who did something brave in their lifetime, changed the course of how people think about religious figures, I think, in a lot of ways. I'm not a religious studies major, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think like even more so than like Jesus just being about like poor people, I think that like his message, I guess let me go back to like establish what I think was like close to what Jesus's message he was preaching was that like, and he's coming out of like maybe like 150 to 100 years before Jesus, like this strain of apocalypticism in Judaism began to develop. And you have, and I think that this is a result of like the years of occupation, even before it was the Romans, and then the Roman occupation during Jesus's time. Like, I think it's emerging as a response to that. And it's this idea that like, in some way, you know, the world, the world we live in fucking sucks. And we're all being oppressed and life is hard. I mean, imagine like life is hard today for people living in the United States and the richest country in the world. Imagine being a peasant in Palestine in the first century. Like, it had to be pretty awful.
So that's pretty rough. High key, that's pretty rough. I won't lie. They didn't even have like modern medicine back then. You just like, I don't know, drained your blood from your skull or whatever in hopes that you didn't die. Like, you know, that sucks.
But basically, that led to this strain of Judaism to develop where people believed that like God would intervene in the world the same way he used to in the Old Testament, right? And bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And that message, like, you can even see it like it's, and like people now take the kingdom of God to be like, now from our Christian perspective, like we read heaven into it. But I think what in general people thought then was just a world where like where God has established justice and things are good.
It's a response to
oppression and these things.
It's a response to like poor material conditions, I think.
Yes. And from your entire, like when you're living under a colonial, an imperial occupation, they are like your entire worldview, the way your life is structured is being eradicated by this outside source. So it's like, to them, it's like their world already had ended and for the worse. So they were hoping for God to establish justice. and so I think Jesus was, you know, coming out of that tradition. And I think for him, like, I really think that, you know, he believed like the kingdom of heaven would exist on earth in this world for people living, and maybe for people who were cool in the past and then like come to life again and hang out. But
and there's this very specific, I do want to point this out, there's very specific idea that there are people who won't get into heaven, who like who will go to hell, you know.
I think Honestly, yeah, like in Jesus's actual message, like I don't think that that's a thing. Like he's not thinking about when I die, am I going to heaven or hell? That's not. I
Yeah.
think like for them, um, like there were people who God was gonna smite, you know? Like,
And to them, that was the Romans.
yes,
Like,
that was me. That,
it was the occupying empire to them that was like
yeah,
the thing that they were, that was like unholy or whatever they were, terminology they were using at the time to
yes,
help
and also,
contextualize.
and like the collaborationists, you know, like the
Mm,
I believe those the Sadducees were like the priestly class who, you know, they like the Romans gave them power to like, you know, to help them preserve hegemony over the area, but they were just collaborationists with the Romans. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And that's a
and
specific distinction that alludes to a kind of consciousness of a class traitor, a group
yeah,
a group that is collaborating with the active oppressor,
yeah.
like
And
that.
we see this in every colonial
Yeah,
situation.
it's very specific, I think. And this story, as you're recounting it and talking about Jesus as this, like, as we're talking about Jesus as this historical figure, and we contextualize his actual story and the material conditions of living back then, it makes a lot more sense what they were saying and why.
Hmm.
Because again, I'm an atheist. I don't believe God is real.
Yeah,
But I do think that for the time in which all of these events were taking place, it made sense for them to think these things. This
yeah,
was very
yeah. There's
logical.
there's no really like not believing in God back then
The
too.
Enlightenment had not happened.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, we were far off. Like,
yeah,
and the divine right of kings was still like was still very present. It wasn't like, I think that kind of taking it to a contemporary aspect here for a second, especially at the time of recording, Charlie Kirk has been assassinated and they apprehended his shooter and everything. It's like I got to talk about it.
trying to be chill, trying to be chill.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to talk about it. You can't stop me. Like, Kirk marketed himself very effectively as a
I think
Christian.
that God smited Charlie.
I do think that God may have smited Charlie Kirk. I'll cut that out. No, but I think that there was this huge panic around, it was a leftist. A leftist killed Charlie Kirk. And I kind of had at first I was obviously very nervous because I was like, if it was, that would be really bad. And then I kind of had to stop and think for a second and be like, the religious right has very much cultivated this outcome. This is not divorced from what the religious right has cultivated as a result of their rhetoric, which is, when we're talking about Jesus as a historical figure, I don't think it's something that, if God is real, Israel, no. If God was like a real guy, I don't think that he would have condoned anything that Charlie Kirk said. I was at work this morning, and strangely enough, on the radio, Steve Harvey's podcast was playing. Don't ask. I didn't even know he had a podcast until I started working and listening to that on the radio. And he was talking about Charlie Kirk, and very accurately was talking about who he was as a person, which was a white nationalist.
Yeah.
And
Was
that,
Steve Harvey being based?
I have no idea. I'm very confused. Like, because I don't know where that man is.
Yeah.
But he was making some really good points. And I know that it's like, how are you going to connect that to Jesus? Well, I think that with everything that Kirk and his whole religious right, like, persona kind of emanated, was not love, but just deep hatred for a lot of different groups, and blame for why material conditions are the way that they are. And he was a grifter more than anything. Jesus was not. Jesus, again, hung out with poor people and prostitutes. His story is very intentional in that, where there's like one story I always think about, because I did actually go to Catholic school for a few years when I lived in England, I know it's terrible, but I remember a story, and I could be completely misrepresenting this story, but there's like an old man who was like sitting on the side of the road, and he needed help, and like rich people wouldn't help him at all. They didn't want anything to do with him, but a poor person who didn't have really have any means at all did choose to help him. And again, I could be terribly recounting this, and it turned out that it was Jesus or God or whatever. And he was like, you're a good person because you helped me even when I was poor and you didn't have to. And like, am I getting that right?
Well, I think you're close. I mean, you're getting it a little wrong, but I think you're referencing the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yes,
right?
yes,
And
yes.
the story is that it's a like, I think like an elderly Jewish man who's like been beaten up and is on the side of the road, and he's like naked on the side of the road, and um like like I can't remember exactly. It's like, a Jew passes them by, and maybe like a priest even like passes them by, and they do nothing. And it's basically like people who would be normies in society pass them by and, don't do anything. And then a Samaritan who, like, at this time, a Samaritan would be like, for lack of this doesn't really apply, but like, it would be like a Palestinian and Israeli.
Yeah.
And, so like a Samaritan would be a Palestinian to an Israeli, right?
Right.
But like there's like a political kind like disagreement, and they don't like each other.
Right.
Like they're all scared of the Samaritans. And so the Samaritan goes by and helps the man and make sure that he gets the help that he needs and saves him, basically. And so Jesus is saying in this story that, and at the end he says like, the Samaritan is closer to the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, than the others. So he's saying that like this person who isn't a Jew, doesn't have a respected place in society, and in fact is outcast by our society, because of their willingness to help another person, is
it's closer
nearer to the kingdom of heaven. It's
closer to God's message. Essentially.
Yes, exactly.
And it, like, that story really, I think kind of shows the complete incompetence of modern day Christians to understand what was the actual political context, and why it was important, and also why they are wrong today. Because you see a lot of churches now really pandering to bourgeois interests, really not wanting to do, there was actually recently just a Fox News host that said that they should euthanize homeless people. He said that very recently, and he had to apologize. And
that would be the furthest possible thing from Jesus' message.
And the people that watch these news anchors are most likely Christian. Are most likely far-right Christian individuals, or even not even far-right, just conservative. Again, my mom was raised Christian fundamentalist. My family no longer is Christian fundamentalist, but for a good chunk of her childhood, they were. And they were also like Reagan voters, overwhelmingly, the impact that Reagan had on the working class is arguably one of the worst. But there's this sense of like, it's almost just devoid of any self-awareness now where Christians who are extremely far right or just conservative in general, they want to have it both ways. You know, they want to have they want to have like the downtrodden narrative of, you know, Jesus was a peasant and everything, but also really pander to bourgeois interests and it's really and say a lot of the same talking points that like a Fox News host would say, you know. And it's very telling how these Christians specifically cherry pick different parts of the Bible and different parts of religious texts to say, well, we can do oppression because XYZ, you know, here's our reasoning why. And it's like, actually, when you look at the broader context of Christianity and you look at the broader context of Jesus as that figure that people love so much, he would not have condoned this. And you're actually really stupid for thinking that he would, you know?
Yeah. I think, like, to go back to the kingdom of God thing, like, for him too, like, where I think, like, he develops that concept and where he's, like, unique, and what I really like about his message is, for him, it would be the kingdom of heaven was for the elements of society that were most oppressed and cast out, and, like, yeah, for us today, it would be homeless people or whatever. And, like, if you look at his miracles, a lot of the time, it's, you know, helping people that, like, to the society at that time, it would have been an anathema to help them. Like, even as a very devout religious Jew at the time, like, you would see those people as shit, you know, like, as not worth being, like, I was reading this one interpretation of like one of the Beatitudes, where it's like where he's basically just saying like the kingdom of heaven will be for, like, infants, for children or whatever. And a lot of times, like the way we interpret that now is, it's like, you know, like, kids are pure and innocent, but this guy was bringing it back to the historical context and saying, like, an infant at that time was like something to be discarded. Because, like, it was common, you know, like, if you have a kid and it's a girl, you leave it to die on the road.
I'm sorry, it's a girl.
And so it's not, like, from a position of, like, oh, they're so innocent. It's from a position of their weakness and that they don't, like, contribute to society.
Right. But Jesus saw that as, like, these people deserve to be in the kingdom of heaven.
Yes. Exactly.
And it's why I think so many Christians and Catholics are getting it wrong with what's going on in Palestine, because, as you said, if Jesus were alive today, he probably would have been a jihadist. Like, he would have been actively fighting against the oppressive Israeli regime, who are currently wiping out an entire ethnic group of people who have lived on that land for thousands of years at this point. And there is evidence to point to the fact that not only was it Muslims who were living on that land to begin with as well, but it was also Jewish people who were living side by side with Muslims, all under the umbrella of Palestinian. And Jesus, if we look at the context of what he was preaching, like, however many
like
thousands
the Good Samaritan, you know?
It was the exact opposite of everything that currently far right Christians and Catholics are trying to push, which I think further shows the church's fall from grace and the church's, like, interests basically being aligned with the bourgeois class more than anything, you know, because if the church were willing to actually be true to what Jesus was preaching and talking about and what the Bible is meant to be as a whole, the context is so important. If we were actually being truthful about what the context of the situation is, they would be on the side of the Palestinians, no doubt. You know, the church, there would have been a million flotillas already, and it would have been headed by churches going to support Palestinians. You know, that would have, I think it's really ridiculous to think that,
come on, guys,
it's stupid, it's misinformed, and it's also completely disingenuous, because Jesus also was not white. Jesus was a brown person. Jesus was like Jesus was a Palestinian.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Jesus and Palestinian didn't even, like, the term Palestinian didn't even exist back then, but it doesn't really matter because Jesus was not a European. For whatever they called themselves back in that time, Jewish, they were not white. And currently the Israeli, so go ahead.
If there's one thing that may have been better back then, it's just that like they didn't really have racism in the same way. Like
no, it wasn't the same concept. And also, I cannot stress this enough. Jesus, like, everything that the modern Israeli state stands for and when it was founded is completely out of line with what actual religious Jewish people believe. Like, you know, we can see this with Orthodox Jews who are completely against the genocide, not only for religious reasons, but also for ethical and moral reasons. But they've talked about the fact that if you actually look at the religious texts, Israel should not be founded right now. Israel can only come about when God, you know, comes back and creates Israel for Jewish people. God has not reemerged. Jesus has not come back down from the clouds. We're still it hasn't happened. And so it's kind of hubris to basically to found a whole state on the presumption that well, Jesus would have wanted this anyway. It's like, you can't speak for him.
And I think for me, like, with Judaism in particular, and like modern Judaism, not even the Judaism of Jesus's time, like, it's so much like what makes it some of the most beautiful things about it to me are because of how, like, of diaspora Judaism and how being a people, you know, without a home,
without a land,
has shaped their beliefs and stuff. And like, and I think that it's like going against some of the most beautiful things in Judaism to be like, no, that's like all of the development, all of the theological arguments and cultural changes we went through in the diaspora, all of that doesn't matter. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I would even push back a little bit and say, like, the Jewish diaspora doesn't meaningfully exist really anymore because, like, Israel, I think it would be a little bit different than, like, for example, like the Afro diaspora, you know, where it's like we could definitely say that, you know, Black people, you know, especially those who were enslaved, you know, came from Africa and everything. And, you know, there's many countries in Africa in which people live. But they're like, you can say, like, definitively, yes, you can trace your lineage back here. And it's not that Jewish people can't do that. It's more that I hear overwhelmingly from a lot of Jewish people that it's like, I don't really feel any connection to Israel, you know, because it's like, we haven't been there for thousands of years, first of all. Yeah. And there's also evidence to prove that Jews were not as a whole expelled all at once. It was more of like...
when I say diaspora, I don't mean like people who were like immediately like really like people who were like kicked out of Palestine or whatever. But like I just mean like, because, you know, there's Jewish people who have lived, you know, across different parts of the Middle East and all throughout Europe and America, and they do have their own like distinct cultural identity.
Absolutely.
That sets them, you know, like they're like outsiders but insiders into the culture, you know. They're in the culture but outside of it in a way. And like I think that is what has given, like, I don't know, like that's, even though Karl Marx wasn't like a religious Jew, like I think that's part of what made him so goated, you know?
Yeah, he was Jewish, Karl Marx was
Yeah,
Jewish. And
yeah,
like I think it's also important to point out that like um there is a group of, I believe, Ethiopian Jews
yeah.
who have not been allowed into Israel because they're black. And
Hmm.
Israel was built specifically for white Ashkenazi Jews to populate the area as a pariah state. It was not a state for all Jews. I talked about this in my genocide episode when we
Hmm.
discussed what's going on in Palestine. But like,
Even
it's
like the Spanish, the Sephardic Jews are like a step down from Ashkenazi Jews, you
yeah,
know?
like even then they are considered a step down, and it's like
Yeah.
that's not. It's really screwed up, and it's sad because when we take it back to Jesus as a guy, it's just a guy who existed at one point, who again, I don't believe in God, but who represented all of these ideas, which
And I also want to make clear, like, people then did not think Jesus was God. Like, that was not a thing. I mean, they might have thought he was the Messiah, but
there's
has a
there's a really
that
large.
has to do specifically with like the apocalyptic thing of like someone is gonna come, and like the Messiah just ushers in the kingdom of heaven. You know, it's um, not that the Messiah is God. And the God thing is a manipulation of like Christianity being absorbed by the Roman Empire, and then projecting like Caesar being a god, and like also like their own mythology of like having avatars of God. Like for them, like God could be on earth, gods plural could be on
Yeah,
earth, right? And
yeah,
like it's a manipulation to Romanize Christianity, you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
Romanized Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's
I wish that was a good thing, but
I think, yeah, when context is so important, context is everything. And when we cherry pick ideas out of Christianity on who who Jesus may or may not have been,
mm,
when we cherry pick context of things that he may or may not have said, and use that as reasoning to why oppression should be allowed, we're missing a fundamental uh, thing here, which is that Jesus was not about that at all. He just was not about oppression like that, And when I bring up the story of like the Good Samaritan, it's kind of showing class dynamics in a lot of ways, showing how like the Good Samaritan could relate way more to the elderly Jewish man on the side of the road than that elderly Jewish man could have probably ever related to the two, higher ranked in society people that passed him by and chose to do nothing, you
mhm.
know, and like that relationship of like people who were struggling under the same oppressor, under the same, and had the same class interests. Like when we think about Jesus's miracles, like, he made, like, one of his miracles was just making food and water for people. Like, if you look at the actual context of that, it means that people didn't have access to like regular meals.
Mhm.
And to them, it was a
Mhm.
miracle to be eating regularly. And
Right.
him bringing that about was
I
like,
mean, I think such a central part of like probably why Jesus was so popular was like I think a lot of his movement was just like eating with people,
yeah,
eating and drinking with people,
the
and
Last Supper.
eating and drinking with anybody regardless of your identity, you know.
Yeah, it was just being like, I I think that that's such important context to understanding like why his message was so important to so many people and why it has transformed into this gigantic movement, because um once again, Jesus was not hanging out with rich people. He was not out
Mhm.
here He was not out here slinging it with, kings and all of these high ranking people. Jesus was hanging out with the poor. Jesus was hanging out with the downtrodden. Again, like prostitutes, all kinds of different people, who he saw as still valuable, still people that he cared about. And then I think about modern day Christianity once again, and that's not happening. And it's like, okay, if we really want to practice good Christianity, which I have no interest in doing, but if we did, we would have to at least accept the fact that any billionaire that says that they're Christian now should be. Any billionaire that says that they are Christian, you should hand them a blank check and say, okay, then write down a number and give it to a random family. All of your money you need to be giving back to the poor.
Yeah.
Like anyone that's rich and says that, oh, I'm a devout Christian, okay, then you shouldn't have billions of dollars.
There's this famous story in the Gospels where Jesus, like, he's in Jerusalem and they're trying, like, they're trying to get him to, like, they present him with like a Roman denarius, or they're basically asking if they should pay taxes to the Romans,
Mm-hmm.
And and Jesus like says, "Give me a Roman denarii," and he says like something along the lines like unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God, or something. And the common interpretation now is to make it say like Jesus was saying, okay, just pay your taxes. That doesn't really have to do with God. And I think really, like, if you take it in the context of how Jesus felt overall about wealth and money, he was really saying tossing this denarii away and being like, why, don't even bother with this. Like, this is not,
right.
Like, money should not be your concern,
Right.
Yeah.
And it's and politically that's really important. Because again, a lot of people, when it came to authority, with like worshiping authority and everything, you kind of just did what you were told. And this idea that you didn't like, that like, not only did it not matter, but also in the larger grand scheme of things, you should pay your taxes, because there's a bigger thing going on here. It doesn't necessarily matter all that much. And a bunch of Republicans are now like, I don't want to pay my taxes. And it's like, I also don't want, my tax money going to, Israel. But at the same time, I would definitely love to pay my taxes if I knew that money was going towards homeless shelters and feeding people. Like, I think that on principle, that's a good thing. That's like a net positive. But I know that's not happening with my tax money right now, because the American empire is currently committing genocide, but that doesn't, like, when we look at Jesus saying that, he was essentially saying there's a bigger thing at play here, that you shouldn't be focusing on this specific issue. And instead kind of looking at the broader context, and also just saying, fuck the Romans.
Yeah.
I don't know how well that came out, but, I think that I was really excited to talk about this and do this episode, because bringing it back to what I said at the beginning, there's this like understanding, and I think the Soviets were wrong in this, where religion cannot coexist under communism. And I don't, am I getting it wrong that the Soviets weren't against it?
I mean, I think that the Soviet, like theoretically they're against religion, but that like they're much more tolerant of religion than people like make it out to be. Like they weren't. And also the context that people really miss is it's not even necessary. It's not really about like people believing in God. Like, oh, you can't believe in God, it's communism now. It's about like, okay, the church is an oppressive institution that owns all of the land in this country, and the priests are treating everyone shitty. And I think a lot of times, like the excesses of their um, attacks on the church were genuinely from like popular sentiment getting out of control because like people did not have a good view of the church, and not because like they hated God or something, but because the church does evil shit.
It was doing oppression. Yeah, like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
church, if it's as it exists, the church is not immune from criticism, and it shouldn't
like
be.
yeah, but like for example, like you know, like even in my own city in Kansas City, it's like some of the most valuable and potentially economically productive uh, properties in our city are owned by the Catholic Church, and they don't have to pay any taxes for it. You know, so like
Yeah.
it's not that I think that Catholicism should be banned, but I don't think that they should be allowed to maintain those relationships to property and the economy, you know.
Yeah, especially like we can also see religious, not religious, well, historical context for this as well, where it's like the church is not new to this kind of practice. You know, there was a
Yeah,
time in which the church was also selling tickets to heaven, saying if you just paid enough money, you were getting into heaven. And that is not at all the truth. Like, that is not at all what Jesus was saying. And it's
yeah,
like, that is, I think, kind of not this, it's not a one for one comparison to what's happening today, but I think that what's happening today, with the church and with the church's support of, you know, like when I was talking about Charlie Kirk and his extreme right wing white supremacy, and like some, not all, but some supportive churches who think that that is like okay, not really realizing that their Messiah was a brown guy, you know, and also not really thinking about the fact that if Jesus was preaching love, and Jesus and God loves everyone, and God is so holy and so and God is just so full of love, why, as an omnipotent, omniscient being, would God ever turn away anyone from the kingdom of heaven? If God created us and God is this all knowing, all loving, all seeing being, why would God not let anyone into heaven? Why would he let his own creations, you know, like what? And then you get into
yeah,
the whole idea of free will and everything, but I'm posing this question, and I'm saying this because I get really frustrated. I think with a lot of religious people, reactionary religious people, who can't seem to get it through their head that I'm not saying you can't practice. I'm communists and at large, dedicated, principled communists are not saying you cannot practice your religion. We're saying you cannot use your religion as a basis for why you should be able to do oppression. We're saying that you don't get the right because you happen to believe in this figure, to then use that and say, well, if you don't believe in him, then I should have the right to oppress you,
yeah.
because that's essentially what they're arguing for. That's essentially what they
Hmm.
want. And it's like, I'm sorry, but no, you don't actually have that right. That's not
Yeah,
actually how it works. And I think that the larger population would be way more amenable to religion and allowing religion in society if it wasn't allowed so much political power. The Vatican should not have any political power. The Vatican has an army. Why?
yeah,
Why? You
yeah.
know,
Why do
like,
they need to like take poor people's money to fund their little goofy army? Like,
yeah. And also, why did priests need to live in castles? You know, Pope Francis famously lived in a little house.
Yeah.
You know, he chose not to live in like the big old whatever they were doing over there, you know, like with all the castles and the rich people shit, you know, like he was not down with that.
Yeah.
And I'm not
Yeah.
saying Pope Francis was a perfect figure, because he certainly had issues,
Hmm.
you know, like he certainly was not a perfect guy. But from the
Yeah.
lens of being a progressive, and how many MAGA Republicans, Christians, and Catholics hated him so much. You know, he was such an unpopular pope for a lot of Republicans. I have to wonder, do you hate him because you don't think he's practicing Christianity or Catholicism good enough, or do you hate him because he does not ascribe to your worldview of white supremacy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Truly,
Yeah.
I'm curious, you know, like actually think about it, because we live in a time in which and this is
Yeah.
oh, go
I
ahead.
think like Pope Francis is like such a good example though of like why we're revolutionaries and not reformists, because it's like I do love all those aspects about Pope Francis. Like he loves
Yeah,
the poor and he makes gestures towards supporting gay people and these things. But like at the same time, like he's not like Jesus. Like he makes it seem like, oh, I'm like living the way Jesus would or whatever. But if he was really like Jesus, then he would be actually wanting to bring down the institution that he's upholding. And he made absolutely zero change in the church. And if anything, like the Catholic Church has gotten more right wing since he was the Pope.
that's
Like,
true. That's a
yeah,
really good point. And I think that the church going so right wing and being so right adjacent and everything, and especially I think there's this really weird offshoot of MAGA supporters who kind of see Trump as Jesus, weirdly enough, who like literally pray to President Trump to change their material conditions.
Donald Trump,
Trump,
please.
President Trump, please, which I think is hilarious. First of all, I think that's very funny. And I will make fun of those people because that's fucking insane. Like, I am going to make fun of your ass if you're out here praying for President Trump. Like, please, that's really stupid. But also, I think that um, it speaks to I think that one of the best honestly one of the best ways to fight against just like complacency and like religious like just allowing religion to completely stomp all over reality is to not be like educated and
Hmm.
like science and everything, and
Yeah.
understanding that two things can be true at once. You know,
Hmm.
you can believe in God and you can believe that God exists, and you can also believe in like modern medicine. Plenty of people
Yeah.
do. It's not impossible.
Yeah.
You know, like I think that praying to a specific political leader speaks to a kind of decay in our current society, which has caused
Yeah.
ultimately good people, I think, to turn to very strange means to kind of contextualize or make sense of their current material reality.
Yeah. I think like I really think that it's kind of like religion works in a dialectic way where it's like
Yeah.
there's these moments, these like revolutionary moments in religion where a movement happens, like the Jesus movement, or like you could even like take it all the way back to like Moses, or but also like the Protestant Reformation, like where there's these moments where the previous system has decayed of belief, or but it's always tied to material conditions in my mind, you know, too. But like the previous system has decayed to the point where like um, it necessitates a revolutionary change in the religion, and then eventually, like after that, you know, revolution happens, then um, like the you know, and it, becomes hegemonic, and like that it becomes the power, right? And then
Yeah.
eventually that decays too, and we get our next
revolution.
revolutionary moment.
Yeah.
Like I think with like the Protestant Reformation, it's like it has to do with like the Catholic Church and their property relations. Like Europe was unable to advance or like make life good for people because of the Catholic Church's like political and economic control over Europe. And what the Protestant Reformation allowed for was it like broke the control of the central authority of the church, and it allowed them to do like land reformation and these things, which I'm taking it from a very material perspective here, but like, it's in that case, it's like spurring from um, an ideological current too. So, but like,
Yeah.
it was necessary for society to advance and for there to be some semblance of justice to break the central authority of the church in Europe. And
Yeah.
and now like, but then it led to the crazy Protestant American Christians. So
yeah, that's very unfortunate. But it's like I think that you really hit the nail on the head with that one, where it's like when you're analyzing these biblical stories and also like religious history in the context of what the material conditions were at the time in a dialectical manner, which is understanding all of the factors which were making this situation possible, you can kind of see like how Christianity can be this revolutionary idea. And it was, like Jesus was a revolutionary figure for his time because he stood up to a central authority which was actively oppressing his people. And he saw that, and like ultimately what he did was just bring about new ideas of like how to move through this world. How did he deal with these material conditions? What did he say about them and everything? That's genuinely what we should be looking at, in the context of like actual reality. What were the material conditions Jesus was facing at the time? And we look at that, we can say, okay, it makes sense why he would say X, Y, Z. Why he would turn, like why he would like make a bunch of bread and fish for people, like in that one story about how he made a bunch of bread and fish for people, like as I was saying, it's because they didn't have food, like it's because they were hungry. Like it's so context is so important to understanding why these ideas were so revolutionary to people. And Jesus was not an institutional figure. He was a guy who really stood up to central authority, and he paid for it. He was crucified.
Yeah, Jesus died for his own sins.
Jesus died for his own sins, but it was seen as dying for our sins, largely because his ideology was preaching love and acceptance and, like love thy neighbor and everything. Which at the time,
which it wasn't. Another thing, let's be clear, like at that time people did not, it was a later construction to say he died for our sins. Like I think that's a very, like if you really want to get into like what happened to Christianity, it starts with Paul. And like because like Paul he was arguably the most important early Christian other than Jesus, and he never knew Jesus. He has our earliest Christian writings we have in the gospel, but the only like thing that he's going off of is that he had a vision of Jesus. Like basically he had like a seizure and had a vision of Jesus, and
he did a lot of mushrooms.
So for him,
had a vision of Jesus.
Where we get to the what happened to Christianity is for him, like the important thing was that Jesus died and came back to life, and he defeated death. And like that is not what was important to Jesus's followers.
Yeah. No, Jesus followed,
Like Paul didn't care about any of the historical facts of Jesus's life except for the crucifixion and the resurrection. That's it for him.
yeah, there's not a lot of contextualization, which is why I think a lot of Jesus's life has been misconstrued as to like fit a certain narrative that's just not true. Because as I've said time and time again, context is so important to understanding why these ideas were so revolutionary and what we can learn from them, which is that, yeah, Jesus was right. You should practice love. You should practice radical acceptance. That's what he was saying. He wasn't out here saying, rights for me, but not for thee. Like, he wasn't out here being like it was so much more, the context was so much different, like so much, it was just completely different.
Yeah.
And that's why I get frustrated at people who try to use, once again, Christianity and, what Jesus would have said, as a means to try to, I don't know, try to rationalize.
Oppress people more.
Yeah, oppress people more and rationalize their own bigoted opinions. Like, I'm sorry, but if you think that Muslim people are inherently like barbaric or bad people, you would have hated Jesus. Because he looks just like the people that you hate so much. Or he looked just like the people that you hate so much. This modern
and thinks like them too. Like,
modern looks at what Jesus might have looked like. I'm like, he was not a white man.
Yeah.
Like, he was, it's just, it's very disingenuous. And, as we wrap up, I think that we should, when we look at when we look at communism and the ideas of communism and the principles behind a revolution and how these things are meant to come about, I don't think Christianity is really opposed to these things. In fact, I think Christianity agrees with a lot of these things. And I think that...
I think it's kind of like a pre-Enlightenment, pre-capitalism version of the same kind of ideas and sentiments.
Very early ideas of the concepts that we know today, that we understand today. Jesus, when I talk about him as like a first revolutionary figure, I say that to say that he was standing up to an empire which was actively doing oppression against his people, and he was able to verbalize that.
Yes, and he believed too that not in just reforming the institutions, and he believed that we needed to fully replace the system that was at hand, that it was so corrupt beyond saving, and that we needed to change that. And I do think there is an argument too that he literally was a revolutionary. I think that I think at some point, he, in my opinion, at the end of his life, or at the end of his teaching, he definitely was probably advocating for a violent revolt. And, but that's also totally you can't say that with 100% certainty.
No, yeah, but it makes sense. And
but his message changes, and he tells his disciples to take up swords and move them. So.
Yeah, it's I had a family member recently try to quote Nelson Mandela to me as a means to say that violent protest doesn't work.
The guy who went to jail for terrorism.
We've been knowing, yes. And I think that it's important as a final leave off message here to not whitewash our figures as quote unquote totally peaceful, amazing beings, but rather imperfect and oftentimes radical beings that did have to struggle for change. They weren't giga chads out here being you can't do oppression anymore.
Yeah.
You can't do oppression anymore. That's not what they were doing. They were actively organizing. They were actively, and that's what Jesus was, an organizer.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a damn good organizer.
He was an organizer around these principles and ideas of love and radical acceptance, and
Yeah.
and pointing out the actual oppressor, the folks who were doing the oppression, which was the empire. You know,
Yeah.
it's the oldest. It's a story as old as time. An oppressive empire is doing something bad to a group of historically oppressed people, and a person rises from the trenches, and you know, the worst and the worst of the worst in society. You know, some of like the lowest classes, to create this like revolutionary like fervor, you know, in this oppressed group, to eventually emancipate themselves. And that is what Nelson Mandela did. That is what you know, Fred Hampton was doing for Black people in the United States in the '60s. You know, like it is a story as old as time. It is not new.
Yeah.
And I think Jesus can be one of the earliest figures pointing to this, like, revolutionary figure, who represents a large working class majority in their fight for emancipation from an oppressor.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
and it's so important to understand that, because I mean, shit, if we're going to sit here and whitewash this figure as somehow inherently a peaceful protester, just a peaceful protester, it's like what white people have done to MLK. You know, completely beaten down his legacy to just being a peaceful protester and not a socialist. You know, who at the end of
Yeah.
his life saw the larger system of capitalism as the problem, and realized that true emancipation of for Black people was not going to happen under the capitalist system. You
Yeah.
know, it was not going to occur, because capitalism in and of itself is oppression. And
Mm-hmm.
you can't do radical change for Black people, or in the case of Jesus, for Jewish people at the time, unless you dismantle the system entirely. There is no reforming it. There is no trying to make it better for, you know, your specific group, because it's always going to result in one person, one group or another being oppressed, because that's how capitalism functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think if I had a closing statement, it would be that if Jesus was alive today, he would say that America is the great Satan, and that we need to restore the kingdom of Allah on earth
Period.
and bring
Yes.
justice for all.
Justice for all. Yes, I agree. And I think this was such a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I love you.
Love you. I'm going to stop.